welcome back to Introductions to Psychology. I'm using a new microphone system, so folks on Zoom, if you can't hear me, please let me know. In this lecture, we'll keep talking about differences, and particularly differences between people and groups of people, which are subjects of psychology. When we talk about differences between people, we often wonder, is this because of some genetic reason, or is it because of society, is it because of culture or learning? And those are actually really big philosophical questions and also big political questions. And we'll talk about also the influences of family and culture and how bias and discrimination can show up. So when we talk about differences between people on some traits, we're talking about a variable. A variable is something that varies. If you were all exactly the same age, age would be a variable in a different class because it doesn't vary. But you're not. It does vary. There's a range on that, right? There's no 3-year-olds in here. There's no 7-year-olds in here. But then it probably centers somewhere too. So maybe the range is from 17 to, I don't know, 30. Maybe the average is around 20. You get the idea, okay? So a variable is a characteristic that varies between people. It takes on different values in different people. Right? You all have a value for age. Okay? You all have a value for height. Okay? And some variables have more range in their values than others. And sometimes that's because you're dealing with a restricted sample, kind of like age in this classroom. But if you went to a public event like a parade, you see a way bigger range of ages. You see babies, you see elderly folks. And that variance plays a role in the relationships that we talk about. And it comes up in say, the strength of correlations. So the first scatter plot shows a perfect negative correlation. Has a value of -1. The minus just means that it's going in an inverse direction. As the score on one axis goes up, goes down on the other. That's what the inverse relationship means. But it's a perfectly predictive relationship. It's like the relationship between your height and the number of inches between the top of your head and the ceiling. And for everyone who's an inch taller, there's an inch less of space between the top of the head and the ceiling. Okay? Relationships in psychology are not that strong. That's a strong correlation of 0.8, well, -0.8. This is the standard for a large correlation. 5. Actually, I might be wrong on that. I'm going to check my table. But this is a high correlation. It's a psychological study. Usually, you're talking about correlations of like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, throw a ticker tape parade. Okay? Like, that doesn't look like a strong relationship. There's a lot of overlap there. Okay, you can have a really high score on this axis and still have a low score on the x-axis, or you can have a really high score on the y-axis and come up with a high score on the x-axis. This is more what we're talking about in psychology. So here's a relationship, and often in psychological studies, the scatter isn't symmetrical. Like you can see there's more scatter over here than in this part of the graph. And that graph suggests that so it's measuring financial need as the percentage of children who are eligible to get a free lunch. The more children who are eligible to get a free lunch, the lower socioeconomic status the community the school is in. That's the idea. Okay, so a big concept like poverty comes down to one specific measure, like the percentage of kids in the school who get a free lunch. Okay, and then this is a school performance score, which is probably based on a basket of indicators like how often do kids show up in class, and what's their math score, and what's their score on a test of verbal ability, okay, that kind of thing. And so that graph shows a general trend, not a hard and fast rule, but the trend there is that the school that has the lowest percent of students who are eligible for free lunch also has the lowest performance score. It looks like there's a relationship. So more free lunches, lower performance scores. But there's still a few what we call outliers, and those are interesting. So you can say, all right, here is a school where there's very few kids who get a free lunch. So maybe it's a rich school, but they're getting a really low performance score. That's an outlier. It's kind of not fitting the expected relationship. And so we might be interested in that and find out what's going on. We might find out there's something different about that school. And one thing that psychologists do a lot of is to say, they eliminate the outlier. Okay, we're like, there's something wrong with that point. Let's take it out of the data set. And then you get a stronger relationship as a consequence of doing it. So experimenters who are biased towards finding a certain result are motivated to take out the outliers they don't like to kind of clean up the relationship. And that's part of the statistical process. So sometimes when someone else repeats the study, it doesn't replicate because it's in a different context. You're doing a different sample, different year, different city. Maybe it's that. But often, if you give another researcher the same data, let's say, I do a study, here are my results, and then you say, hey, give me your Excel sheet. I'm going to analyze that. You might find something different because you took a different statistical approach where you say, no, actually, we're going to keep that data point there. Okay? So it's another way that the biases can come in. The percentage of variance, think of variance of what's going on in one variable that's explained by the other is represented by the square of the correlation coefficient. So take a perfect relationship, the relationship between your height and the space between the top of your head and the ceiling, okay? Very reliable. Square one, what do you get? 1. Means your height predicts all of the variance in distance to the ceiling. That's like a perfect prediction. But since it's a square, let's say the correlation is 0.9. What's the percentage of variance explained going to be? It's not 0.9 anymore, is it? It's lower. It's 0.81. And what if the relationship's even weaker? What if it's 0.5? Uh-oh, there's an exponentially decreasing relationship. So the weaker the correlation, like the predictive power of, say, the x on y is exponentially lower. So in psychology, when we have these correlations of like 0.2, well, 0.2 times 0.2 is 0.04%. What if the thing you're measuring only explains 4% of what's going on and what you're trying to predict? It's not very much, is it? Okay? So in psychology, we put a lot of explanatory variables, and they tend to all predict a little bit of what's going on in what we call the dependent variables. So one of those together. They might even interact with each other. I'm having a kind of a psychic vision. I'm seeing you writing your quiz. I think it's like I can almost see the test item, and it's something about R squared. Keep that in mind. Okay, the square correlation coefficient, R squared, is the percentage of variance in y that is predicted by x. So when you're considering making a decision, like a government policy based on a relationship, there are a lot of things you have to consider. You have to ask, well, is the difference reliable? You found it in one study. I finished the last lecture about 5 minutes early, and I felt like I was missing something. And I realized what it was. I didn't mention statistical significance. Does anyone know what statistical significance means? Raise your hand and I will throw the microphone at you so the people on Zoom can hear you. This is intimidating. It's a question about statistical significance, and I will throw the microphone at you. You want to answer? No? Ready? I'm bad at throwing. I hope I don't hurt the computer.
It helps decide whether or not a result is likely due to chance or some factor interest.
Yeah. So imagine if there was no difference, right? And what is the difference I'm talking about? The difference in depression scores between the treatment and the control group. Let's say the treatment is totally ineffective. Okay, let's take off an athletic. That worked. Good job. So let's say we want to know if our therapy works, okay? And if the therapy works, well, people should be less depressed in the therapy group than in the control group. But let's say it doesn't work, and we start with a null hypothesis. We assume it doesn't work, and then we try to disprove that, because things work by disproving in science. So the true difference is 0, and there's all these random variables that affect how you find the difference, what the size of the differences you find. And if you did an infinite number of studies, the average of the results would be 0. But every time you do it, you might find a small difference in favor of the control group, or a small difference in favor of the treatment group. But the really big differences are less and less likely to happen. And so statistical significance is the probability that you've got a result that big or bigger based on chance alone. And we say, we'll take a chance of up to 5%. So that's called alpha. So we set alpha, the criterion, sort of like the limit. No, that's not alpha. Yes, that's just a bad alpha. Okay, is 0.05. And we want the p-value of the study. So you do some stats and it gives you this probability value. You'll do that in second year. And you want to get a value that's less than 0.05, less than 5%. If you get 6%, too bad, no result. There is, when we're comparing demographic groups, like let's say we're comparing men and women, right? Or we're comparing Christians and Muslims. When we're comparing groups, there's generally more variation within than between the groups. So I have a frequency distribution there. It's kind of like your bell curve. And it shows some score. And in the normal distribution, the bell curve, most people fall in the middle. Most people are average, okay? And there's a few people who have extremely below average scores, and a few people who have extremely above average scores. And now, let's say we're going to compare it to two groups. So let's say the blue is men and the pink is women. That's kind of what a difference between groups would look like. Because we might talk about a mean difference, but there's actually a whole distribution. Okay? And so what the purple area is showing is the overlap. Okay? And there's something there that you don't need to know. It's called Cohen's d, and it's a measure of effect size. But this is the sort of small effect that you would typically find in psychology. That's how much overlap you would get between the two distributions. This is a very large effect that you would very rarely find in a psychological study. Now here's a difference that you can see. Difference in the average height between men and women. Okay, most guys that you meet are taller than most girls that you meet. If you meet a guy who's sort of shorter than the average girl, you sort of notice. Same thing with a really tall woman. That difference has a Cohen's d value of 1.7. It's twice that. But a lot of us think of differences in psychology as being like so grossly obvious that they're like that difference in the kinds. No, they're much, much, much smaller than that, and there's much more overlap. Now there's something in your textbook that is interesting. I put a lot of time into this last year. It says no more than 5% of the genetic differences among humans arise from population group differences. So 95% of genetic variation exists within populations. The typical genetic difference between two South Africans or between two Singaporeans is much greater than the average difference between the two groups. Thus, if after a worldwide catastrophe only South Africans and Singaporeans survive, the human species would suffer only a trivial reduction in its genetic diversity. If you guys are using the adaptive learning in Achieve, you might see a question like this. It's one of the publisher test bank questions. Of the following, who are likely to show the greater genetic differences? A, two individuals from the same small village in Denmark. B, a group of Swedes and a group of Koreans. C, these are, you can't find any genetic differences in people. That's obviously wrong. And D, a group of Canadians and a group of Koreans. According to your textbook and according to your Achieve, the correct answer is A. And I used that on one of my tests, but as many instructors do, I changed the words so it's harder to Google, because all of those, I think, questions are out there. And a student wrote to me, okay, she said, I'm looking over my quiz 2 results, and I'm looking for clarification. I'm confused about how two individuals from the same small population have the most different genetic makeup. I double-checked my answer with an article from the U.S. National Library of Medicine, and they said, when enough loci are considered, individuals from these population groups will always be genetically most similar to members of their own group. I'm assuming this is simply a marking error. I'm just confirming to be safe. And she attached the paper, and I read it. And after reading the paper, I said, oh, I think she's right. And, but I don't know. I'm not a statistician. I'm not a population geneticist. This student was actually taking a class in genetics. And so I asked 7 different academics. I asked a professional statistician. I asked the textbook authors. I asked a biologist. I asked an evolutionary psychologist. And I asked a biological psychologist. And I got 7 different answers, and the statistician was really onto it. Okay? So something called, I spent like, it must have been a week on this, and this was politically sensitive. One of the people that contributed an answer got upset that I shared it with the class. But it is called Lewontin's fallacy. And without sort of getting into it, the psychologists are talking about population genetics based on some study that was done like 50 years ago. They're messing up all the statistics. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're way up for this. Okay, so you can look up Lewontin's fallacy if you like, but you can see there that they're citing Lewontin. So if that doesn't make sense to you, that's why. They don't really know what differences they're talking about and what that means. So when we talk about differences between groups, we often wonder about the cause. Right? So is it nature, genetics, or biology, or is it nurture, social influences? And the question of, is it a genetic difference? Is the field of behavior genetics? But these are big questions because there are social and political consequences to the identification of differences and to their causes, especially when that variable is something that is prized by society, say intelligence, or something that's despised by society, say that the violent crime rate. Okay. So if the cause of the difference is or is thought to be biological, then that suggests something different about how you handle it or what you do, or how you interpret it. And that can go well for people or not. So for non-heterosexual or transgender people, the biological basis of sexuality and gender idea could mean that they're born that way. And they shouldn't be stigmatized for having made a choice that some people construct as bad. But Mark Mercer, who's a philosopher here, says that it doesn't matter if it's a choice or not, you should never abuse people, because that's relevant. But then, the hereditary nature of intelligence has been used as a justification for eugenics, for forced sterilization, forced labor, genocide. So you might find difference. The difference might be real. And then, what causes it? And now what are you going to go do because of that story? If the cause of the difference is nurture, if it's social, then it suggests that we have to be aware of our social responsibility for managing it. Like if we say the difference is a problem. And let's say that there's a difference in crime rate between groups, and it's attributable to environmental factors like poverty. Well, and what should we do about that? And what systemic or structural or cultural issues do you need to address? And that could be inconvenient, especially those who benefit from social inequality. They might not be motivated to recognize that. And if you could identify a biological basis for criminal behavior, well then you might have an interest in emphasizing that. You know, these are just the type of people that do these types of crimes because there's something to do with their neurotransmitters. And then you could deflect attention from the social issues. So obviously, there is a biological, genetic basis to all behavior. You can never get away from that, right? Your behavior is produced by your brain and your nervous system. Okay? And your brain and your nervous system developed along a genetic blueprint that you inherited from your parents. If your parents were goats, you wouldn't be here. So let's say you took a tiny kitten away from its mother, and you hand-raised it, and you read to it every day, and you did your absolute best to teach it to read, you used all the best evidence-based reading programs. Are you going to end up with an adult cat that can read? No, right? It's not going to work. Like, obviously not. So, because cats simply don't have a brain that has the cognitive apparatus for language. So nurture works on what nature provides, okay? You can only teach a human to read, and in fact, you have to do that while the human is young enough. Right? There's a critical period at which people can't learn to learn language. Okay? If there's a child that is never spoken to, you can't just start talking to them when they're 10. It's actually very hard to teach an adult who never learned to read to do so. And they won't achieve a high reading level. Because by that point, the brain doesn't have the neuroplasticity, which is the ability to make new connections that children do. Children's brains are very plastic. They can make new connections easily. After puberty, that changes. So there are biologically based critical periods for learning. So cats don't have the genetic basis to have the ability to read. It doesn't matter how hard you try or what technique you use, or how long you spend at it, it will never work. So obviously, things like brain regions and genes and neurotransmitters are important. There's a famous study in psychology, we'll learn about it in a minute, about learning. It's a little Albert experiment. And the behaviorist psychologists who did this were able to teach the child to fear a rat. So first they let Albert play with a rat, and he thought it was great. But then, next time they introduced the rat, they struck a metal bar that was behind his head. He got upset. Pair that a few times, and now bring the rat, and he's scared. He starts crying. But what was interesting about this study was that it's true generalized. So he was also scared of like a Santa mask and just white fluffy things in general. It's called fear generalization. And it's part of PTSD. So if something bad happens to you and you're still kind of on edge here now, means you generalized your fear from the original context. And there have been many efforts, not particularly successful, to create a rat model of PTSD. So psychologists have done their best to give rats PTSD by putting them in situations that scare them, like kind of the one that was being done at the lab I worked in Dell was some kind of a water maze where they're afraid of drowning. Sometimes they use cats. Anyway, while the rats are very scared in that environment, they're fine back in the home cage. They'll be scared in the water maze, bring them back to the cage room, and they're fine. So they don't seem to have that same cognitive capacity, right? The human has a different cognitive capacity to learn and generalize that learning, but the rat doesn't seem to have. And that would come down to biological differences in the complexity of the brain and the nervous system. So heredity refers to the genetic transfer of characteristics from parents to their offspring. In grade 12 biology, you might have learned about Mendele and his pea plants. He was working at the same time that Francis Skeleton discovered that intelligence would have a hereditary component. So, oh, sorry, that's my email's going off. Let me turn that off. So, stop doing that. Heritability is a population level outcome. It means that, say, so if you say something like 50, that say schizophrenia is 50% heritable, that is not referring to a single individual, that's referring to a sample, or ideally to a population, okay? That would say that 50% of the variance in whether you have schizophrenia or not, right, at the population level for everyone is attributable to genetic factors. It doesn't mean that 50% of your IQ score reflects your parents' intelligence, and the other 50% came from your home and school environment, right, or nutrition. Okay? That's not an individual level measure. Heritability is it's a relative and contextual measure, and it reflects factors in the design of a study. So it depends on the range of the variables that you measure, or that are in your sample. Okay, so if I measured the heritability of an intelligence, but I used this class as a study sample, well then I'm not working with a whole range of IQ scores in the population, right? Because there's nobody here with an IQ of 60. Right? I'm looking at what, like 100 to 130. I'm working with a distributed range. That makes it a lot harder to find relationships, right? So range restriction affects your ability to find relationships. The textbook gives what I think is a rather cruel example of raising boys in barrels until they're 12 and then testing their intelligence. If you actually did something like that, sort of complete control on environment, everyone raised in a barrel, well, actually, there's no intelligence measure at the end of that. The idea is that range restriction on environment would force you to conclude that all of the variance you saw in IQ scores is due to heredity, because you can't attribute it to environment. There's no variance in environment that can be attributed to. You get the idea? That idea there is attributed to Mark Twain. So let's read. What do they see? Consider humorist Mark Twain's fictional idea of raising boys in barrels to age 12, feeding them through a hole. If we were to follow his suggestion, the boys would all emerge with lower than normal intelligence scores at age 12. That's not Mark Twain's original quote. See how they present it with authority? And you'd read that and believe Mark Twain actually said that? So the original quote is, when a child turns 12, he should be kept in a barrel and fed through the bunghole until he reaches 16, at which time he plugs the bunghole. Kind of nasty. That's not even what he said. But what I do want you to notice is that there's a tertiary source that's interpreting secondary sources. And when somebody writes a textbook, and they base it on 1,000 different sources, they add a lot of their own interpretation. So researchers commonly determine the heritability of a trait with twin studies. So identical twins who are raised together theoretically have identical genetic makeup, and they have what's good enough to be called the same environment. Fraternal twins who are raised together are genetically different, or like siblings, but we'll say they have the same environment. It's not perfectly the same, good enough. And then we can have identical twins who are raised apart. Say they're adopted into different families. And we can compare those two people and say, oh, well, you know, they had parents who had schizophrenia. And we wonder which twin will get schizophrenia. We'll both. It doesn't matter if they were raised in the home environment with their parents or in a different environment. So if we want to look at the role of heredity in the development of mental illness, we compare the rate of its development in identical twins raised together to, say, fraternal twins raised together. And so you see that sort of genetic role here. So when identical twins are raised together, if one twin has schizophrenia, the probability that the other has it is 50%. But when we look at fraternal twins raised together, if one of the twins has schizophrenia, the chance that the other twin will have it is 15%. So that tells you that there's a role of genetics there. If we want to look at the role of environment, we could look at identical twins who were raised apart. So same genetics, different environments. There's still range restriction on the environment because all of these kids are being raised in industrial societies where there's a child welfare system. So you're not going to see the full range of environment. And often to see effects with child raising, you need to have extreme neglect or deprivation. And no well-functioning system would have a child adopted into that kind of an environment. What the studies find is that adopted children do tend to be more similar to their genetics than to their environmental relatives. And it would depend on the variable, but say personality, more like their parents. There is a study in your textbook that's quite famous about the Jim twins, and they were separated at birth, and they ended up living very, very similar lives and having the same job and basically building the same bench, and they both married women named Linda. It's an interesting study. But we aren't really letting the environment vary that much, okay? And it's the extreme environments that substantially affect development. So, we're not looking at the entire range of environments which would run between like being raised by wolves or being adopted into the most advantaged environment possible. So, adopted children do tend to have better outcomes than siblings who were not adopted, like if the biological parent has more children. And that's sort of because if a child's given up for adoption or removed from their parent, it is where it should be for a good reason, and that it's in the best interest of the child. And so families that are approved to adopt children have to jump through a lot of hoops to demonstrate that they're competent to do so. Otherwise, there is no parenting license. There's also, but that research finding that adopted kids are more similar to their biological relatives is corroborated by case studies on sets of twins that get accidentally mixed up in the hospital and sent home with the wrong family. So what about identical twins who are raised in radically different environments? And there is a case where one twin was raised Jewish and the other one was raised on the other side of the world and in a Nazi society. And they spoke different languages. They chose different careers. Often you find twins with the same career. These ones chose different ones. And they had a lot of difficulty establishing a relationship. But they ultimately did after they found out that they had the same taste for playing practical jokes. And they had a lot of little weird things in common, like the way they like scratch their head with their pinky finger, or they both flush the toilet before using it. Right? They had some mannerisms that were eerily identical. So now what if a child actually was raised by wolves? This does happen. It's not an ethically approved kind of experiment. But human children have been raised by social animals, most notably dogs. And those extreme circumstances demonstrate a large effect of the environment. And I had a video to play for you, but it doesn't have the play button on it, so I can post that to Brightspace. But if I played that, what you would see is this young woman acting like a dog and running like a dog in a way that's like really impressive. I didn't know that somebody could run like that on a horse and barking and howling. So the children that grow up, they're raised like that, they act like the animals that raised them. Okay? And depending on how late they're found, they might never develop the ability to speak or act like a human. And when that happens, it is called a natural experiment. And because it wouldn't be ethical to run that study. There's a picture there from famous research on attachment by Harry Harlow, and he did experimental studies on social deprivation in monkeys, and they were quite heart-wrenching. Thus we have these review boards. Nature and nurture interact. So there's a sort of false dichotomy, and the whole question is it nature or is it nurture? Is it biology or is it environment? Obviously it's both. So nature works on what nature provides. Nature sort of sets the boundaries on a range of possible outcomes. So your cat can never learn to read, but it does have the cognitive apparatus to be trained to use the toilet. Okay? It can learn some more complex behaviors. A person with Down syndrome, which is caused by a chromosomal anomaly, can't have like an above average IQ. It doesn't matter how much you invest in their education. They're never going to be a rocket scientist. But there's a lot of material to work with. And when folks with Down syndromes were institutionalized and just kind of not invested in, well, they had really low IQs. But now we know that with a lot of support, right, and education and care, they'll still have a below average IQ, but it's way higher, and they can, live great lives. The brain responds to learning and experience by developing synapses. So there are connections between brain cells, and your brain can grow them, and you can lose them. And when you learn to do something, that connection is created at that level. Rats that are raised in enriched environments show greater brain development, more connections, compared to rats that are raised in impoverished environments. If you want to maintain those connections, you have to keep using the skill. Otherwise, you'll lose it. Your body will use that, the energy that's invested in maintaining that connection for something else. Okay? It's adaptive. So let's say you learn to figure skate and you stop skating for years. You don't get back on the ice like you used to skate when you were a teenager. But it's not like it's the first time you ever skated. You could learn skating faster than somebody that never did it before. Something is left over. But the point is, there's a lot of atrophy. After puberty, the brain prunes off unused connections. and then it becomes more difficult to learn new things. It's easier for a child to learn how to play the piano or to learn a new language, and they can do so without an accent. But if you learn a new language as an older person, that's not to say that you shouldn't. It's still good for your brain. You'll probably have an accent. There's nothing wrong with having an accent, but it'll take you longer as well. Something else that develops over time is your personality. So as we get older, because of our social learning, rewards, and punishments, we develop more socially desirable personality traits. So we get more agreeable and more emotionally stable. And that said, we all come with a hardwired temperament. So when a baby is born, doctors, midwives can notice some differences in the temperament of babies. Some babies are friendly. Some babies are really happy and bubbly. Right? Some babies are, they're just harder to upset. They're more chill. Okay? Temperament sticks with you, so the cranky baby is probably going to run a little cranky at home. Some people's nervous systems are just more reactive than others. Some of us have more emotional ups and downs, and some of us are more stable. And having those ups and downs is called the neuroticism on the 5-factor model. On the 6-factor model, which I'll be using, is called emotional stability. Some of us have nervous systems that are more sensitive to, more easily overwhelmed by incoming stimuli. So introverts are more sensitive to stimulation. They're more aroused at baseline. They're more quickly overwhelmed by a lot of hullabaloo. Extroverts, and when I talk about introverts and extroverts, most of you are ambiverts in the middle. Some people are introverts. A few people are introverts and extroverts. Okay? But extroverts run cognitively understimulated. Okay? If they're at home by themselves and start feeling kind of sad, and they want to go out, the introvert's like, yay! And so the extrovert might like to go and study in the library where there's a lot of hustle and bustle, and you can say hi to people. Right? We need that. They might do riskier things like going bungee jumping, because they would enjoy getting that kind of boost of arousal. They're a little bit understimulated. And there's a study that found that lemon tastes more sour to introverts. They salivate more when exposed to that stimulus. Experience can change the expression of genes. Epigenetics is a discipline that studies the environmental influences on gene expression. So think of the effects of toxins and stress and nutrition on your body and how it develops. Over a very, very long period of time, like we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years, we've evolved to be hardwired to do things that historically have been adaptive. Okay? Because people who behave in more adaptive ways are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce and leave offspring who also share that trait. And that principle of adaptivity also applies to cultural differences, because different cultures, there are different cultures and different physical environments where people learn to navigate different challenges. Organizational culture is based on the way that an organization has learned to solve a particular problem over time. Right? Surviving in a desert is a different game than surviving in a jungle or a place with a harsh winter or in the mountains. Right? Winning at those games requires different skills and different habits, and those become ingrained in culture. And cultures pass down socially learned behavior that, at least at some point, help the group solve problems and survive. So in Tibet, they have a practice of polyamory, where there's like one wife and several husbands who are brothers, and that is related to what works for population control in a rocky, rural area where farmable land is very scarce and you don't want to divide it up. Cultures that rely on the farming of wheat tend to be more individualistic than cultures that rely on the farming of rice. That requires a really high degree of cooperation in order to get enough water to the rice. amount of water on your rice really affects your neighbor, okay? Just to irrigate the land. The text uses gender differences between men and women to illustrate this evolutionary perspective and talk about sexuality. So there is a well-replicated cross-cultural finding that in general, men are more sexually motivated than women. Just more interested in doing it and with more people. It's not true of not every man is more sexually motivated than every woman, but the general trend is that way. And you can sort of see that play out in erotica that's marketed to men or women. So for men, it tends to be very visual, get straight to the point, very minimal plot. Everyone's having a good time quickly. And then for erotica that's marketed to women, there's like a lot less sex, right? There's a lot more story, it's more verbal and narrative, there's character development and relationship drama and sort of emotional ups and downs, right? And then a lot of sex and stuff. So evolutionary psychology would ask, well, what does this, how is this adaptive? Like how does this difference in choice or in interest help us survive and reproduce as a species? And the issue of evolutionary psychology is you come up with some story, but there's no way to test it, really. So, but we can speculate that, say that compared to women, either fewer costs and more benefits to promiscuity to men. It means more potential pregnancies, more opportunities to pass on that trait. But there's way less sort of procreative benefit to having a lot of sex for a woman, because she can only get pregnant like a couple of days a month, and there's only like a 20% chance of that happening. So if you're focusing on, if your outcome is passing along the trait and then having a pregnancy, it's like, then they need a lot less sex to achieve that. Right? And there's all kinds of personal risks to having more sex. You could get an STI, you have internal anatomy, there's the risk of carrying the pregnancy to term, of giving birth. Like until recently, that was super dangerous. I think it was like many women died before 40 just because they died in childbirth. And they do a lot more of the child raising and right, including that breastfeeding. And so for a woman to successfully pass on her genes, it makes more sense for her to invest in having, a few children survive to adulthood. Okay, so it matters more to her to have a father around who can provide the safety and the resources and help raise that child and create a child of, higher genetic quality, if you please. And so the argument from the evolutionary psychology is that it's in a woman's interest, from that evolutionary perspective, to be very selective and to say no a lot. Men tend to be more attracted to women who look young and healthy and fertile. I think the most popular kind of porn is teens, I think that's the biggest category. And who have an hourglass figure. And wide hips, which translates to an easier childbirth experience. That's not true cross-culturally. There's some cultures where men favor much larger looking women. But then those are cultures that exist in environments where there's a lot of scarcity, where starvation is a thing. So thin could be a problem there. Women tend to be more attracted to powerful men who are taller, who are more dominant, who have and control resources. There was a study where they showed men and women, heterosexual men and women, a picture of a member of the opposite sex in a car. It's like either a luxury car or like a beat-up car. And then asked them to rate the physical attractiveness of that person. Men's ratings of the physical attractiveness of a woman have nothing to do with the car. They don't care if she's in the beat-up car or the luxury car. But the women's ratings of the physical attractiveness of the man varied based on the car. They were higher when he was in a luxury car. Any look? Same guy. So overall, women tend to be much chewier, pickier beaters than men and say no more often. There was a study at one university where they got the female research assistants, I hope they're well paid for this, to sort of go up to guys and say, hey, I've seen you around campus, and would you go to bed with me? See if they said yes or no. What do you think the percentage that said yes was?
I don't know.
What did you say?
Men were like unrealistically high, like 85%.
It was up there, so they had 75, 80.
And then like women were like 15%.
Yeah, way, way lower. Apparently, some of the guys on that site were like, well, you know, do we have to wait till tomorrow? Like, looking out. Anyway, so the game would be that it's in men's interest to choose widely and for women's interest to choose wisely. Okay? And so that the male choices are about optimizing the chance of their producing offspring, and the female choice is more about optimizing the chance of the offspring surviving. They both matter. But these are general tendencies. Even if they're cross-cultural, even if they're pretty strong, even if they predict what category of porn sells the most, okay? But they take place in a context of much greater diversity. So they don't describe everyone. They're not the preferences of every woman or man in the population. So to the disappointment of my family, I'm not attracted to high-status men. And when I was an undergrad like you, I had a lot of pressure from my family to study in the Dalhousie Med School library, even though I was not studying psychology, so that a medical student would trip over me there, and then I could get my MRS. Right? That was like, why are you studying in the medical school library? It's such a nice place to study. And this was like a fight I had with my mom a lot. Right. So some men date older women. Okay, that's Emmanuel Macron, his wife's like 30 years older than them. Some women aren't attracted to men, right? Some people are intersex, and neither men or women. And some people aren't motivated to have any kind of sexual relationship at all. The critique of the evolutionary perspective is that it's a story, right? It's an idea. You can't really prove that. And then how would evolutionary psychology explain homosexuality? Certainly wouldn't predict it, but now that since we know it exists, then I can come up with something to rationalize it. And the evolutionary psychology explanation for it is kin selection. So it takes a village to raise a child, much better if there's some folks that don't have children, so that that's the idea. But how do you prove that? Right? So they're not falsifiable. Evolutionary psychology works as a good kind of unifying theory. When we're looking at somebody's behavior here and now, sometimes social learning is a better explanation than evolutionary psychology, just based on your decisions made by your very distant ancestors. And then, what are you going to do with that story? So let's say you have a story for, why we do things a certain way, like, why men have more social dominance. Doesn't mean that it should be the way we do things, or that we can't try to do things differently. Now, evolutionary psychology would say that we're wired in ways that worked for our ancestors. And Homo sapiens evolved 200,000 years ago. And so what are we wired for? So the kind of environment we live in now. So we used to sleep with the cycle of the sun. And now you've got electric lights and your cell phones. That's really new. Like in terms of the history of our species, that's just like less than a second. Okay? We are wired to like sweet tastes. And fatty tastes. And that might drive a lot of junk food consumption that isn't so healthy for us. We are, our bodies are wired to get a lot of exercise. It's not the lifestyle that we've built today. We're equipped to know about 100 people. now have like 1,000 Facebook friends. Can your brain even keep track of that? So some of the differences that we observe between genders reflect biological differences. So like testosterone is known to increase sex drive and aggression as well. There's a difference between sex and gender. So sex is based on biological characteristics, and the way we do it is look between a baby's legs when the baby's born, and you say, sort of, that's a girl or that's a boy. But actually, male and female aren't the only sex. Intersex is also a valid category. You can look at between a baby's legs and really see something in the middle of that scale at around a 3 or a 4. Gender is different from sex, and it refers to the sort of psychological or social, behavioral characteristics that are about a gender role or a psychological sense of identity. They're about a social role. Okay? So biological difference versus social role, and what society expects people, with this part or that part to do, and what role they should fulfill. And for the longest time, there was no birth control, and we had more rigid expectations for what women do versus what men do. This gender is about, whether you wear pink or blue or stay home with your kids, it's that kind of thing. Okay? And those roles can change over time and place. And somebody's gender identity is a complex interplay that's between their biological disposition, their hormones, their developmental experiences, right, their preferences, their situation. That picture there is of an intersex athlete. And she identifies as a woman, is biologically intersex, and that's caused a lot of consternation for the groups that regulate athletic competitions because they don't have a category. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that person, right? There are intersex people. We don't have a place for them, at least in that society. But other cultures have a place for intersex and transgender people. The textbook summarizes gender differences between men and women that have been reliably found in the psychological literature, keeping in mind that 85% of psychological studies are done on undergraduates like you. So what do they find? Well, they find that women tend to be more relationship-oriented, more likely to have social interests in working helping professions like psychology. About 80% of psychology students are female. Tend to have more supportive or democratic styles as leaders, be less motivated by pay, more likely to be religious, more likely to perpetrate relational aggression, like sort of gossip and rumor spreading kind of bullying. And there are certain psychological disorders that occur more often in women. There are like mood disorders, attachment disorders, eating disorders. And then men are more likely to be found working in STEM fields. They have more realistic interests, would rather be like tinkering and with an engine, that kind of thing. More likely to choose leadership positions, have more directive styles, more motivated by pay. Certain psychological disorders that occur with greater frequency in males. There are autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, social personality disorder, more likely to have substance use disorders, much more likely to die by suicide, less likely to attempt it, okay, less likely to be religious, and then more likely to perpetrate physical aggression and have criminal convictions. Masculinity and femininity are, I had a question that just popped up at the lectern, and someone asked, isn't it more accurate that women are just as likely to have autism and ADHD, but less likely to be diagnosed? Maybe. You could look into that. I don't know off the top of my head.
Since the parameters.
Sorry, can I throw this at you?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
See if I'm making any. The parameters set for testing ADHD and autism are based off those who were born male. So it is in my experience, less likely for somebody who was born female to be diagnosed with autism or ADHD because the parameters set do not take into consideration the social expectations set on women. When I went to get my diagnosis for ADHD, they told me I might not get it because I had good marks in school. So, that's typically. And the same happened with my mom and her autism diagnosis.
I know that with ADHD, for example, it presents different in females and males. So for males, it's more jiggly, physically interactive, but in females, it's more focus-based and kind of more not, it doesn't show as much as males. So I think it's also more diagnosed in males just because it's more physically, it shows more physically, where females is more internally or like not as much physically showing.
Disagree with that.
They had studies that showed that women have more, are more likely to be focus-based, for instance.
But is that because that's genetics, or is that because of the social expectations set on women to behave more ladylike, in quotations, than men do? Because I've seen similar traits in my cousin, who was younger, that my mom has talked about experiencing when she was a kid before she was told that she can't act like that because she needs to act like a lady. So I don't know.
So it could be kind of playing to both.
Yeah, that was really interesting conversation to listen to. You have to throw it, chuck it over.
Just pass it gently.
I was like diagnosed with autism when I was very young, so I know that like for a lot of the times, autism in women is just confused with so many other things, and it's so hard to identify from other things. That's the reason why women are diagnosed so much less, because they like always, it's kind of like the last thing they want to diagnose you with. They kind of just test out every single thing, and then autism.
Yeah. This has been really interesting to listen to, and one of the things I'm noticing is that you're reifying the diagnoses as if they had like the pack of salt existence. So there's a set of behaviors that we put a label on and call ADHD, and that ADHD is a philosophical abstract construct, and it applies to it comes from a certain social context, which is the classroom setting. And you know, this is not a very natural environment. This is quite highly artificial. Environments like this tend to work better for women. So this kind of classroom environment in school tends to work better for little girls than for little boys. And let's say the little boys aren't focusing or paying attention. What's easier to do? Is it easier to come up with an entirely new learning environment, or pathologize that person?
I find it really interesting that you said it's better, the classroom environment is better for little girls than it is for boys. But I had so much trouble fitting into a classroom environment, especially when I moved schools from the 2nd to the 4th grade. It was really rough until I had a teacher that looked at me and said, let's adjust some things to help you out, because the classroom environment doesn't work for me very well. It's gotten better over the years because I've been able to adapt.
Yeah.
But when I was younger, it did not work for me. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't keep my mouth shut. I was in recess detention almost constantly.
But you can learn, and you know lots of things, right? That environment was not a good fit for you.
No, it wasn't. But
So we create one environment, we stick all the kids in it.
Yes.
And if it works for you, you're normal. If it doesn't work for you, then there's something wrong with you. That's kind of the way we set it up.
Yeah.
There was another comment here at the lecture that's interesting. Women also have much higher ability to maths, which contributes them being underdiagnosed. But doctors also have a tendency to mistreat female patients and diagnose them with BPD. 2 different points there. The BPD one I will be coming back to. Thank you. in a different unit. But if you are, want the microphone?
No, I don't throw it, I can't catch it.
Okay.
Pass it on to you.
I pass it out.
Just to try. Okay. Okay.
Okay, so I was also wondering like, what disorders overlap with like autism and ADHD if it's still hard to diagnose.
What is the overlap between autism and
A lot
ADHD?
of times with men, I guess, it's a lot more easier. They'll figure it out early on, like in developmental years. But with women, they won't figure it out, or as doctors won't figure it out until like, I don't know, teenage years or something. So like, what is the big confusion that causes one to go so commonly undiagnosed? Or what behaviors get, I guess, masked or confused with actual symptoms and actual personality traits?
They're different disorders. In the case of autism, there's an issue with kind of theory of mind and whether we can understand that somebody else has a different mind with different thoughts and a different perspective. That's sort of at the bottom of autism. It's about that kind of social development. And there's other things too, like hypersensitivity, being really sensitive to sounds and feelings, having a really rigid interest in a certain thing. And then ADHD is an attention disorder. And between the two of them, so all mental illnesses are socially constructed, all of them. They have biological basis and then a sort of sociological basis. And some disorders are way more socially specific than others. So depression is something you see cross-culturally, so schizophrenia, but eating disorders are very Western. And there's a certain mental illness in Japan where you work so hard you die at your desk that it's like unheard of here. And so ADHD is a Western industrial society classroom kind of thing, right? Talking about ADHD doesn't make any sense for hunter-gatherers. But our tendency is to be positivist, and to reify the diagnosis and talk about it like it's solved. So there's that. That's one level of it. When you're talking about having two diagnoses at once, that's called comorbidity, and it's possible. And then sometimes it can be hard to find out, well, does their behavior fit better with this label or with that label? And there's rules. Like you have to, there's, I don't know, there's like 8 things for depression. You have to meet 5 of them, and it has to be over the last 2 weeks. So there's sort of hoops to jump through with diagnosis. Actually, you can keep it until someone else wants it. Oh, I'll move it over.
We tried. I was just gonna touch based on what someone said in the chat with the BPD thing. I know you're coming back to that, but
Oh yes, it's very important. So I want you all to see a BPD screen, what it looks like, so you know when you get one from a doctor.
they're like, I find too, like, I know a lot of people that are diagnosed with BPD that later came to be diagnosed with ADHD, which also happened to me, like, as a child, which typically BPD is more commonly diagnosed at 18 or, like, older. But, like, adult ADHD and adult BPD, often, like, ADHD is more, like, impulsivity and, like, BPD is more emotional. But often, like, the risk factors are still the same, so a lot of times, like, coming back to, like, men most commonly being diagnosed with ADHD and women being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, I feel like a lot of people are, like, misdiagnosed with BPD when in reality they have ADHD.
There's a lot more controversy and disagreement than in psychology than, say, in physics. So, like, two physicists won't have a wildly different opinion about gravity, but you can have 2 psychologists with wildly different opinions on BPD. And so I'll answer from my own perspective, and I don't speak for all of psychology, and I speak from I have a certain lens, which is more of a social constructivist lens. I don't see anything about personality theory that says that borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder. To me, it looks like a stress response. So I wouldn't...
I feel like they don't have, like, a set reason for why it happens, and, like, it can be generic, but I feel like it also is environmental as well.
If you're in an abusive relationship and you're having, like, something like a social PTSD thing, and you go to your doctor, you're going to find out that that's not seen as a valid form of PTSD, even the symptoms look just like it. And instead of concerned about your environment and what's happening to you, you're going to get a BPD screen. okay? And that puts it on you. And that pathologizes the person, and that's kind of part of a system where we don't believe people who are reporting systemic abuse, because you're going to the system to report the abuse,
I feel like too,
or to a system that's connected to other systems.
yeah, oftentimes with me too, when people are diagnosed, it's usually just kind of like a diagnosis to be like really learning your emotions and like
Yeah.
stuff, and also just like the help people get, it's always like labeled as like, oh, you have BPD, like we can't help you, which is often.
I see that. Chuck it back to me.
That was I'm sorry.
Oh, just try that one again. I wonder what this sounds like.
I know that there's like a big, like, I guess I don't know what word to say other than like pipeline between like autism and BPD, like especially when people are like unknowingly have autism, like if it's invalidated often, like chances are like if they grow in an environment and they're already hypersensitive, it can develop BPD pretty easily, and so I feel like that's another reason why women are always like lastly diagnosed with like autism and diagnosed with BPD, because there's just so many different like parts of autism that are similar to other mental illnesses because of that hypersensitivity aspect.
And you can go to different providers and they'll give you different diagnoses. You pass it over.
And I like the word pipeline. That's an interesting way to put that. I don't know much about BPD, but I do know that ADHD and autism behaviors that we classify as behaviors when we're giving the criteria for the disorders have a lot of overlap in between. I've only really noticed it between women in ADHD and autism because my mother has autism and I have ADHD, and we still share, I mean, she also has ADHD, but we share a lot of similar like reactions and characteristics to things, but there are some differences. So if that's a reason that people are having issue like getting diagnosed, because it's like you have all these behaviors for this thing, but that can mean either one, so maybe you don't have either, I'm not sure. Maybe that's something that's happening with the BPD and the autism and the ADHD thing too. Maybe there's a lot of similar behaviors that are
Because these are at the highest level abstract philosophical constructs. And
yeah,
that's
but
why
I'm talking about like the criteria we give to decide who has these constructs. Because you have to, like you said, if you're testing for depression, maybe there's like 8 questions and you can get 5 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So you get many different presentations, like different
Yeah.
permutations.
And a lot of behaviors that we characterize as being an autistic behavior or an ADHD behavior often are ones we characterize as both.
Can you guys keep it down?
So maybe that's an issue that's happening with that as well. Maybe?
Yeah, it could be. So masculinity, I'm going to get back to the slides, we'll keep it there for now. Masculinity and femininity also have that abstract philosophical level. So, what is masculinity and what is femininity? That's about the gender role. Classically, and when I say classically, I mean let's go back to Greek and Roman mythology and values. Classically, it's about dominance and submission, where the masculine is dominant and agentic, and the feminine is submissive and reactive. But not all cultures do that. That has a specific kind of Western perspective. Psyche is a feminine hero. She's very submissive. She always does what someone tells her. And it's usually a man or a male spirit doing that, okay? She should have never listened to her sisters. The psychological orientation to be dominant or submissive is reflected in the personality trait of agreeableness versus disagreeableness. We'll talk about that more in the unit on personality next week. And the research that I've seen does not show any evidence of a sex difference in that trait. I liked the discussion. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to take the rest of the lecture.